Let's get spooky. Hey y'all, my name is Nat. I hope you're having a terrific day today, and for this video we are going to be doing a 5x5 of last year's Goodreads horror finalist. Before we get into anything bookish, however, make sure to hit like and subscribe down below, as well as tell me in the comments what did you vote for as the best horror book of 2021. If you are new to my channel, my 5x5 is a series in which I am trying to find 5 5-star reads in one themed video. I have not succeeded thus far, but I will put a link to the playlist in the cards if you're interested in seeing the previous tries. So this time around, I am doing the 2021 Goodreads horror finalists. I will say, this came about because last year's winner was Final Girl Support Group by Grady Hendrix. Personally, I don't think this deserved to win. I gave it 2 stars whenever I read it for a Grady Hendrix taste test last year, and honestly, this is one of those scenarios where it really shows that the Goodreads Choice Awards, it's a popularity contest. I couldn't help myself. I started wondering which of the other finalists deserved to win. With that, I thought it was the perfect opportunity to make this into a 5x5, particularly because options 3 through 7 were already on my TBR. For the layout of this video, I'm going to give you the summary of the book I am reading, followed by a 50% update with an estimated rating, and then a final update with an actual rating. We're going to start with the book which was in 3rd place and work down to the book that was in 7th place. So first up was The Last House on Needless Street by Catriona Ward. This story is set in the creepy house on Needless Street, where we are following a man named Ted, his pet cat Olivia, his daughter Lauren, and then his new next door neighbor. And if I'm being completely honest, that's all the summary you need to know. Hey guys, so I have officially surpassed the halfway point into The Last House on Needless Street, and this book is weird. I'm having such a hard time getting a hold of the plot in this story, and yet intrigue is like 10 out of 10 right now. I need to know what's going on. I can't stop listening to it. Every time I start into the book, I am just so sucked in, have to keep going. It's so strange. There are 2 things that really make me feel incredibly off balance with this book. The alternating writing styles. Some perspectives are in 1st person present tense, others are in 3rd person past tense, and then on top of that, the atmosphere is just so strong, so creepy, incredibly unsettling, and it's just making it so I'm having such a hard time getting my footing in this world. So I constantly just feel like I'm off balance, and yet it pairs perfectly with the story. I think Catriona Ward's done an amazing job with entering you into the world. Like I said, I don't know what's going on, and yet I need to keep reading. Obviously, with the theme of this video, this is marketed as horror. Thus far, nothing really horrific has happened. Perhaps an argument could be made for horror in your own mind. The events that are taking place within the plot definitely lead you to think a certain way, which is in fact horrific and unfortunately realistic. If things were to go that way, it would feel far too obvious. It would make way too much sense. And there's definitely a lot of stuff within the plot and for some of the characters that's being held back, which tells me it's not going to be that simple. It's not going to be that easy. That answer can't be it. This almost feels more character-driven than really story-focused. We're spending so much time getting to know each of our main characters. So right now we are alternating between the perspectives of Ted, Dee, and Olivia. Olivia is the cat, Ted is her owner, and then Dee is the sister of the girl who went missing. Obviously, I'm a bit partial towards Olivia because she is a cat, but at the same time, I have to say I do really enjoy Dee's perspective because it feels like we're getting the most development of the plot and maybe slowly moving towards an answer in her perspective. However, I can't say that though. Like at the same time, in Ted's perspective as well, kind of starting to better understand the layout. But I feel like every time we finish one of his chapters, I just come away with more questions. None of which I can bring up to you because I feel like it might go into spoilers. I don't know. I don't really understand where this is going, and yet, again, have to keep reading. Basically, just bringing back to my original comment at the very beginning, this is a really weird book. Currently, I am estimating 4 stars. I have no idea where this is going. However, I can say I've heard this has crazy twists at the end. I'll be okay if I don't figure out what's going on because I've had such a wild ride, but I would love to get an actual answer. Hey guys, so I've officially finished out The Last House on Needless Street, and this is going to be really short and sweet because I don't want to talk about this book at all for y'all. Like, honestly, going into it with the smallest amount of a synopsis, if you have the intrigue to push through, I think you deserve this ending twist. It's freaking weird. But with that being said, you definitely have to push through the first 75% of this book, which feels like it isn't going anywhere. It's just kind of rolling in circles. At the same time, the intrigue, for me at least, was a 10 out of 10 on Copile. It was through the roof. I had to figure out what was going on, especially once we had that final reveal happen. My brain went into overdrive. I was connecting all the dots. I was laying out every piece of evidence that could have possibly led us into this reveal. The suspense was just fantastically built, and I honestly think it paid off pretty well. The situation that happened here, I've seen something similar to it in the past. I think it could have been handled very poorly. However, I highly recommend reading Ward's author note at the very end of the book because I think it puts everything into a new perspective for you. It kind of takes a twist that, like I said, I've seen before and I definitely know has been utilized in other places and flips it on its head, which I think was very well done in the end. I also think she handled it quite respectfully because of what she ended up doing. There were a few things here and there that I suspected, but I wouldn't have put my money on them. The final reveal overall, though, yeah, definitely took me off guard. It shifts your entire view of the story thus far and unveils the true horror in this, and I think it was just so well done. Overall, this did have a few body horror elements, but on the whole, I definitely think it is more psychological because she definitely leads you down a path of thinking and then just like upends the whole thing, pulls the rug right out from under you. The entire way I was gripped. It was just incredibly well written. I cannot wait to check out more of Catriona Ward's work. My Copile breakdown came out to about a 4.5 stars, but honestly, for the sake of this video, I'm rounding it up to a 5-star. I got 1 5-star here. First book down, and we already have a 5 stars. Wow, this is a great start to a video. Next up was A Dowry of Blood by 𝗖cie Ich𝗁𝗁𝗁. This was a book I was incredibly excited to pick up because I have heard so many positive things about it. This is a retelling of Dracula from the perspective of his first bride, Constanta. Hey guys, so I have hit the halfway point into A Dowry of Blood by 𝗖cie Ich𝗁𝗁𝗁. Starting out, I think it was such a cool choice to tell this story in a epistolary format, specifically having Constanta, our main character, writing him letters after the time of his death, so perfectly in her head, but it also gives us a glimpse of what is to come, calls back to the original format of Dracula, and I just really appreciate that. Although I am listening to the audiobook, deeply regret not buying a physical copy. It's poetic, it's evocative, it's emotional. I probably would be marking every single page if I did have a physical copy, but damn it, pass Nat. Right from the start of the book, as soon as Dracula and Constanta meet, it is quite obvious to us that this relationship is toxic. It is concerningly codependent. They are so reliant on one another. He saves her life, and we can definitely see that Constanta has some transference occur where she equates him saving her life for love. Not healthy, not good. Tying in the pros and the relationship between the two of them, the scene where Dracula turns her is both so beautiful and so revolting, and that contrast just permeates the rest of the book. It even actually starts to extend to both of their relationships with Magdalena, the second bride, who I've recently met. There is an initial charisma about Dracula. It doesn't take long for us to see his true colors. He gaslights and manipulates Constanta, utilizing her love for him as a weapon almost. He twists her feelings to make her do things he wants. We see that a lot whenever she meets Magdalena for the first time. This is a pretty short book. I think it's less than 300 pages. The audiobook's like maybe 6 hours. But across all three of those characters, one thing I am so impressed with is the characterization of them. And the dynamic all three of them have together is what's most interesting. The abusive relationship angle of this story is so fascinating. Like, that is definitely at the forefront of my mind every time I'm reading this book. Pacing is definitely on the slower side, which I think you kind of just expect whenever there's this gorgeous prose-like writing in books. And there is some spice, but it's not done in a way where it's, you know, romantic or puts you in that feeling. It's almost uncomfortable, not in the way of being cringy, but in the way that you can't help but remember this is such a abusive, toxic relationship. It's hard to look at these sexual situations as a positive thing. So I also think that was really clever of the author to kind of take a romantic fantasy book and twist your perspective on the spicy elements. Across the board, I'm really enjoying this. I think I'm gonna estimate 4 stars because I don't estimate 5, but I would not be surprised if this goes higher than a 4 stars. I'll say that.
Hey guys, I know this is a very different setup for me, but I just finished filming my makeup and books tag, so we're just working with where my camera is currently at. Anyway, I finished out A Dowry of Blood, and guys, I think this might be 5 stars. It was so good. So good. So good. The writing really was everything that I've heard. It was gorgeous. It was beautiful. It was lyrical. It was almost like poetry. There were these little things the author did within the story that really grabbed my attention by the end of the book, and I think just made it that much more impactful. For example, there is so much power in the fact that Constanza never names Dracula. Not once. We never hear his true name in this book. And that is so impressive, but given the fact of how this book is sold and marketed, you don't really need to. Everybody knows who Dracula is, but Constanza does not give him the power by giving him a name in this story. He has lost her respect, he has lost that right, and she takes his power from him in more ways than one. I mentioned that there is such a wonderful contrast throughout this book between the beauty and the terrifying aspects of it, and that really did permeate the entire story. Definitely impacted the meeting of the second bride, Magdalena, but it also was just as impactful for the third bride, 𝗖cie. I also think it was very clever on Gibson's part to change the third bride into a man, and not only does it keep up with the times, it adds a new layer to the story, but I also think it fits with the whole sexual fluidity that comes with vampires. The relationship that forms between all 3 of the brides, though, was also fantastic. It's so subtle and yet so well done. They each have their roles that they play in the relationship with Dracula, but also in the relationship with one another. On top of that, though, they also each have their stereotypical roles that fit within this gothic story. For example, with 𝗖cie, I really could not help but compare him to Claudia from Interview with the Vampire. He has a very similar feel of that young innocent who is corrupted throughout the story. I still maintain that given how short this book is, the characterization across the board was fantastically done. But in particular, the creation development of Constanza is so powerful. It really takes the cake. It wins above all others. At the beginning of this book, I could not stand her. She was everything in a protagonist that I hate. But as we see her relationship with Dracula develop, and as we see them moving forward in time, her getting to know him more, and truly starting to understand what kind of a man he is, she starts to develop in such small ways that although on the outside she appears to still be the same meek, mild-mannered girl, she really has changed so much. She takes back her power and she starts fighting for not only the freedom of herself, but for the other 2 brides. I really enjoyed this book so much. I think the showcasing of a toxic relationship in this situation, as well as how polygamist relationships works, both of those were absolutely fantastically done. I really enjoyed this. Like I said, my cough file came out to like 4.6, but honestly, it's 5 stars. It's 5 stars. It was so good. Now I just need to get my hands on a physical copy so I can actually go through and annotate it.
2 5 stars? Guys, it's going great. We're doing awesome. This is fantastic. Rolling on to the next book. My Heart is a Chainsaw by Stephen Graham Jones. I have had 2 previous run-ins with Graham Jones's work and really enjoyed them, so I was pretty excited to pick up this one. This story is following our main character of Jade, who is obsessed with horror movies and convinced that one is about to start in her small town, particularly when she meets Lena, who she knows has to be the final girl. Hey y'all, so I have hit the halfway point into My Heart is a Chainsaw by Stephen Graham Jones, and yeah, we have another odd one going on. Based off the summary, I thought this was going to be a very character-focused book, but then I started it and I wasn't so sure about it because of the beginning events. They're very shocking, definitely bleak, but I wasn't really understanding the significance of them, so I was a little confused when the story started off. However, once I got a little further in, we spend a lot, and I mean a lot of time in Jade's head. She is our main character. She is obsessed with slasher movies. She goes through and breaks down all of the different parts of her town, explains why this is clearly the perfect setting for a up-and-coming slasher, which was what really made me start questioning whether this was going to be a truly character-based story. But now that I've hit about the halfway point, I'm finally starting to kind of see where this is going, what is the importance behind everything that we are learning, finding the real depth to Jade apart from her obsession with slashers. The writing style of this one fits so perfectly with the mind of a slasher-obsessed teenage girl, but it's also pretty difficult to follow at times. I listened to the first 10% of the audiobook and then stopped, realized I had no idea anything that had just taken place, and ended up going back at a slower speed to try and acclimate myself to the writing style first. There are so many pop culture references, unsurprisingly, to big name 80s slasher movies and not so big name ones as well, but there's also just other mentions of horror and mystery stories, plenty of other pop culture references added to those too. Jade literally loses herself in her mind quite often, and she goes on these different tangents about all the different characters and their roles within the slasher that's developing within this town, the different people she knows and the roles they would play in those stories. It does remind me a lot of the writing style in Night of the Mannequins, which I read last year, and I did really enjoy it there because it so perfectly puts you into this main character's head. It takes a little while to get used to it. As far as the horror parts of this book go, we get a very creepy prologue to start off, but once we enter into Jade's perspective, it feels like everything horror-based is mostly in her mind. There are plenty of gory references, lots of gross images, and historic horror stories that have taken place within the town, which I do think kind of lends into creating this very unsettling atmosphere throughout the book. But not only that, separating the chapters are excerpts of Jade's history papers, which she wrote mostly focusing around different horror movies, the different factors that make up a slasher movie, and the importance of them, the stories that they are telling there. On one hand, these excerpts were very funky in terms of pacing, but on the other hand, given the fact that I was having such a hard time really grasping what was going on within the book at the beginning, I also really enjoyed these excerpts because it felt like they were giving us some explanation as to where this could possibly be going. Since we spend an immense amount of time in Jade's perspective, I do think she is the most well characterized. Honestly, really interested in where the heck this is possibly gonna go, because I could definitely see one route this would take in terms of horror story, but it's completely possible this goes in the opposite direction of what I'm thinking. I'm not really sure with Stephen Graham Jones. He could definitely go either way. Thus far, I am enjoying this. It's just the fact that I was so confused for the first half and was having such a hard time really getting a grip on this that unfortunately, I think my estimated rating is gonna have to be like a 3.5 stars. I would love for this to go higher. I don't know what's happening, and unfortunately my intrigue is not nearly as high in this one as it was in The Last House on Needless Street. So that isn't really giving my rating any bump this time around. Hey y'all, so I officially finished out My Heart is a Chainsaw, and this was kind of confusing, especially towards the end, but I think I liked it. I know I told you guys that this started out with a bang, but I wasn't really sure what the significance of that event was, and then I thought I was finally starting to truly understand who Jade was as a character and where the story was going once we hit that midway point. But nope, I did not. We quickly then descended back into Jade believing that a slasher was developing in her town, and I was sort of lost all over again. In my head, I definitely kept likening this to The Night of the Mannequins, and I think those similarities really continued to grow once we hit that climax scene, because I became so lost in Jade's overactive mind, trying to figure out what was real, what wasn't, and that really just became even more shocking once all of this gore starts up around her. I gotta say, the climax definitely delivered on those horror elements, oh my lord. In regards to some of the twists that were taking place, however, I did kind of see them coming. Definitely one regarding Jade especially, I guessed that from right out of the gate whenever she started mentioning a certain element that I'm trying not to mention because spoilers. Even though I was kind of confused, I do think the finale of this book really brought everything full circle and just delivered that gut punch about Jade's character and her background all over again. I was just so impressed at how Stephen Graham Jones was able to tie in all of these really serious subjects to this horror story, but at the same time, this was kind of crazy slow and sort of was losing me. I think Jade was the most well-created character across all else, and I didn't care about anybody else, which I think does a bit of a disservice once we hit that climax scene. So in the end, I went with about 3.5 stars on this one. I liked it, but not as much as The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. However, I'm definitely still going to continue checking out more of his work. Damn it. Spoke too soon. Next up is The Book of Accidents by Chuck Wendig. This story is following a family who decides to move into the father's childhood home after his abusive dad passed away. However, every member of the family starts to experience weird things. Hey y'all, so I've hit the halfway point into The Book of Accidents by Chuck Wendig, and this is a weird book. But I guess a lot of these books have been weird books, so what's that saying? I'll admit this is really unsettling in a way that I just cannot pin down for you. I'm sorry. We're alternating POVs between the husband, the wife, and their son. With me listening to the audiobook, there is actually a male and female narrator. Unfortunately, the male narrator doesn't do much of a change to his voice to dictate the difference between the father and the son. Even with that, I still haven't really gotten too confused with the perspectives. I'm also not a big fan of the fact that POV changes don't happen consistently. Sometimes they will happen at the top of the chapter, other times they'll happen mid-chapter. There was one longer chapter where we actually would kind of go in a recurring triangle between the three, and on one hand, I think it was doing a great job of building suspense, but on the other hand, I just didn't like it for consistency's sake. As far as characters go, the parents, Nate and Maddie, seem to have a really healthy relationship, and I actually really like them. They also just genuinely feel like a couple that has been together for 15 years. Their son, Oliver, also does read like an actual teenage boy as well. He is incredibly empathetic. To a fault. He describes actually seeing people's pain, and I'm not sure if that's going to lend into the paranormal element or if that may just be in his head. Either way though, it's a very intriguing part of his character. But unfortunately, he is also very naive at times, and God, it makes me want to smack him upside the head. This definitely is going to go the paranormal horror route. It's not hard to see that, and I'm not mad about it. It has this funky combination of being almost a haunted house serial killer story, but also there's this kid who's like weirdly inserting himself into their lives like a wannabe JD from Heathers. So many different things going on between these three perspectives. I will praise this as far as logic goes because Nate and Maddie are each experiencing their own really weird things they cannot explain, and rather than just continuously deny it, push it down, and let it fester, they actually talk it out. And I found that incredibly refreshing in a horror book also. Obviously, Oliver, their son, doesn't do that because he's a 15-year-old and, you know, talking to your parents isn't cool when you're a teenager. So with those three different major elements that are kind of lending into the plot, I'm really intrigued, but I also can't quite figure out how I'm feeling about this book. There's a lot happening, but at the same time, given how big this book is, I think I would finally start putting together pieces by this point, and I still haven't. I'm not sure if this is going to be similar to Last House on Needless Street, where I'm completely lost until 70% in, and then finally things start making sense, but I hope it happens here soon. I don't want to have to push through an entire 500-page book for, like, the last 100 pages to be the juicy bit. I just don't really have any clue as to how all of this stuff that has been established is going to come together and give us a cohesive, satisfying conclusion. So with that, my estimated rating is 3.5 stars because that's perfectly middle of the road, and I don't know how I'm gonna feel about this in the end. Hey y'all, so I officially finished out The Book of Accidents by Chuck Wendig, and this was weird. I feel like that's just my go-to description for every one of these books. It was weird, and it developed into something I was not expecting, but I don't mean that in the most positive way possible. As I hoped wouldn't be the case, like the last 25% of this book was truly the juiciest. That's not even what I'm really upset about. I think this was just too big and tried to do too much. Definitely could have done with some editing down. As I said, the last 25% juiciest. Reveals shocking. I will say I was taken on quite a roller coaster ride with this book. It interweaves like sci-fi horror with a haunted house, a serial killer story, and then also black magic, demons. I'm not really sure how I should specify that. All put together, it just seemed a little bit like a mess. I think one or two of these honestly could have been pulled out and it wouldn't really have affected the story that much. It makes sense that the book is so long because it took the time to explore all of these different avenues, but as I said, not necessarily the best thing to do here. The world building is pretty strong. It does tie in with many of these different routes, but because of how long this book is and the fact that Wendig was really trying to reinforce every one of these did make it come across a little repetitive at times. Also made for a very slow-paced story. Even with that though, my intrigue was pretty high the entire way through, but towards the end of the book, I couldn't believe that more was still happening. It felt like the climax took so long because we would constantly cut away, jump between perspectives, and on one hand, I do think that helped with like building that suspense, but on the other hand, it was just like, come on, you've dragged me through 400 pages already. There's been enough build up. In terms of characters, I did like all three of our main characters the entire way through. I do think that the son Oliver had the most development throughout the story, and by the end of the book, I did enjoy his perspective the most. I really like how his empathy ability, which I mentioned previously, was handled. While I do think that Nate and Maddie each had their own strong arcs as well, they just didn't stick with me quite as much as Oliver's did. I don't think the ending we see with these three characters is particularly surprising. I do wish Wendig had taken a jump and done something a little bit more shocking. So in the end, I kind of like this. I also feel like it perfectly met my expectations with my estimated rating. It was a 3.5 stars in the end. I liked it, but honestly, I don't think this book should have been over 500 pages. We were on such a roll. Got too excited. Lastly is All's Well by Mona Awad. Now, okay, going into Mona Awad, I knew this was gonna be a weird story. We are following a young theater professor who, unfortunately, after an accident, is plagued with chronic pain. Although she is wanting to put on All's Well That Ends Well by Shakespeare, she's convinced that all of her students are actually working against her to put on Macbeth. However, she meets two strange benefactors and things start to change.
Hey y'all, so I've hit the halfway point into All's Well by Mona Awad, and from what I remember of Bunny, I think this stayed more realistic for a longer beginning, but it still got really weird. If you're curious for a review of it, I'll put a link to that in the cards over there. Anyway, focusing on All's Well, I definitely am impressed with the fact that the main character's pain is such a constant topic that underlays all of her thoughts, interactions, everything, and then the consistent dismissal of it from her peers, from her students, from her doctors. It's really impressive that Awad has showcased in the writing just how much her pain really impacts her everyday life. Similar with my feelings to Bunny, I really love how Awad does not pull her punches when it comes to inner dialogue. I mean, Miranda is vicious at times. She is brutally honest, she is darkly funny, she somehow manages to always relate things to sex, which is kind of impressive at times. Miranda's definitely one of those characters where, like, if her inner monologue became an external monologue, ooh, there'd be a lot of problems. At the beginning, there is so much of us getting lost in Miranda's head, her reminiscing about her previous life prior to the accident that left her with this pain, so many fictitious conversations, imagined scenarios, before something ends up crashing her back into the present. It's an unusual style, but it is reminiscent to her previous book, and the one other book I can kind of liken it to is Anxious People with the omniscient narrator. It's funny, but at the same time, it can be oh so dark, and like I said previously, there's just this oppressive tone of her pain. As much as I'm enjoying reading about everything from Miranda's perspective, she's not a likable person. On one hand, I definitely sympathize with her, but on the opposite side, it also can be kind of frustrating and exhausting being in her mindset, and I'm just so impressed with Awad that she is balancing the both of those feelings. Unsurprisingly, once we get into the real thick of the story, I got confused. I'm sure I wasn't the only person who got confused and was having a hard time figuring out what was happening. It's so interesting that when the book really starts to lean into the horror side is also when it becomes way more difficult to follow what is actually happening. But the thing that really clued me into what took place was the shift in the tone. It goes from this very somber, oppressive tone to this happy, upbeat thing. It's so different. It's so interesting to see the contrast of the first part and the second part of the book. I should also explain, this is in fact broken down into separate parts. I believe I'm about halfway through the second one right now. So the contrast is both very impressive in terms of writing, but also really unsettling in a reading experience, because where is this going? What is going to happen here? I have no idea, but I'm in for the ride. I also think that the use of repetition is really well handled in the writing. It can convey the tone, it can convey the energy, it can convey the emotions and the power behind them. Like, Awad's writing is so impressive. Her writing does not read like any other horror books I pick up a lot. It's so unique, it makes itself stand out. It's so interesting. I love it. It's so good. I think my estimated rating for right now is a 4-star. I could definitely see this going higher. I really hope it will. If this ends the same way Bunny did, where I was just totally lost and confused, had to go do research about what happened here, I think I might like it even more. Is that weird to say?
Hey y'all, so I officially finished out All's Well by Mona Awad, and just like I suspected, this was so confusing at the end. Definitely slid into madness, not really sure what happened there, but I do know I enjoyed it. Once we move into the third act and we are getting closer and closer to opening night for the show, we spend so much more time lost in Miranda's delusions and trying to slowly find our way back to what is actually happening and what is reality for her. And then guys, the part that I did not anticipate but I actually really enjoyed a whole lot was how prevalent witchcraft became in the latter half of this book. I think it was mentioned a time or two at the beginning, but in the second half of the book, it is definitely this ongoing theme, and it both fits so perfectly with Shakespeare, but also with the setting of a New England college. With those, the horror elements of the story really started to lean more into like magical realism, which I think furthered the whole sliding into madness confusion as to what is really happening, what is just Miranda's perceived notion of the events. The pacing is incredibly fast at the end, even though you're just sitting there like, what the heck is happening? You have to keep going because you need to figure out if you're gonna get a final answer. I just couldn't stop listening to it. It was so weird. It was so good though. Yeah, my overall feelings with this are very similar to Bunny, but I think I really enjoyed the themes throughout this one a lot more than Bunny. Honestly, I kind of want to buy a copy of this and reread it and actually go through and annotate it. Oh my gosh, dude, you're attacking my hand so much. So as for my estimated rating, yeah, it was incorrect. I think I'm actually gonna give this 5 stars. I really enjoyed it. It was very thought-provoking. I loved the way Miranda's chronic pain just underlied the entire story. I thought it was so interesting. The writing around it was just absolutely fantastic. There were some quotes that like aren't clean, simple ones you can put in a notebook, but they're ones you want to go through and highlight and think about. I just thought they were so good. So good. I really enjoyed this book.
Okay, so technically, we still didn't get a 5 by 5, but 3 out of 5, that's really good odds. That's great numbers. All right, y'all, so that is it for today. Thank you so much for coming to my channel. I really appreciate it. Make sure to hit like and subscribe down below. I have all my socials linked in the description if you're interested in keeping up with what I am reading. I come out with videos on Monday and Friday, but until then, I hope you continue to have a terrific day. Love you, bye!